The first one is the Lord's Day Act, which was enacted in 1906. Canada's House of Commons enacted a law to protect Sunday from certain business activities and sporting activities, because in Christianity that Sunday is the Lord's Day, which is a special day where people kind of rest from their normal labors. That's the Christian concept. So that was enacted by the Parliament in 1906, and it stayed in effect until it was uprooted by the Charter in 1985. But the fact that Canada had a specific law to enact the Christian Lord's Day is a very strong very strong example of Christian influence on Canadian politics. The second example I use is Christian influence in Ontario public schools. Now, the reason I use Ontario is because in Canada, education is a provincial responsibility. So you have to look at each province individually. And Ontario, being the biggest province, it had the biggest impact in a sense. It also had, there was so much evidence about the Christian impact of or influence on education policy in Ontario. Like right from the beginning of Ontario's public education system in the early 1800s, there was Christian influence. It even got a bit stronger in the 20th century. And that remained, like there was two aspects to that Christian influence. One is what are called religious exercises. And that's like opening or closing exercises where you have prayer and Bible reading. So that's one component. The other component is actual religious content, like teaching of Christian content. So Ontario had both of those in their regulations, educational regulations, until late 1980s, when they were struck down as a result of the Charter. They were struck down by the Ontario Court of Appeal because of the Charter. So, by the 80s, some of the public schools weren't actually following those regulations, but some of the ones, especially in rural areas, were, and they would have stayed in place, except that they were struck down because of the Charter. But when you have explicit Christian influences in an public education system, it says something about that culture, about that society. You have a particular religious influence in the education. It shows that religion has influenced that culture. So those are the two examples so far. The final example is Canada's definition of marriage. Like until 2003, Canada's definition of marriage was an explicitly Christian definition of marriage. It was a carryover from Britain. There had been a court decision in Britain in the 1800s about what marriage is, and it was an explicitly Christian definition. And so when Canada became an independent country, that was the definition we had, and it was struck down by the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2003. Now, 2 years later, of course, it was changed by the House of Commons, but it's nevertheless the first undermining of the definition of marriage was the Ontario Court of Appeal on the basis of the Charter. So these are three major examples of Christian influence in Canada, and in each case, they were struck down as a direct result of the Charter being implemented by Pierre Trudeau.